A Christmas Crime by William Henry Bishop. This is a Librvox recording. All Librvox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librvox.org. A Christmas Crime. Mr. Gilbert was a stately-looking girl in a soft white gown with a scarf of the same material tied lightly about her shoulders. There was a sort of Marie Antoinette suggestion in her aspect, and also, as it were, the shadow of a brooding sorrow hanging over her. She was from somewhere or other. We haven't always time in this busy world of ours to find out where everybody is from. There was a general impression that she had lately come back from abroad. She was visiting in town. She was a friend of our hostess, Mrs. Grumbold, or had been particularly recommended to her, and that lively young matron had invited her for this dinner. People came rather late, and Mrs. Grumbold, busy with about 100 things at once, as was her usual custom, was not able to tell much about this guest in advance either. Mr. Gruzzletree, who took Mr. Gilbert in, was particularly impressed by her. Indeed, he induced the hostess to change the arrangement already made and give her to him. Towards him, on the contrary, she showed as much asperity as politeness permitted. If he drew from her an occasional rare pale smile, it was only by the exertion of his utmost powers of entertainment. Who was Mr. Gruzzletree? Oh, Gruzzletree was a kind of law unto himself. He was one of those persons such as we meet with in our journeys about the club end of town. In short, Gruzzletree was Gruzzletree. It was Christmas Eve. After dinner, a couple of standard young banjo players of North America gave some selections. Miss Amy Gobboy, of the Amateur Comedy Company, recited a sweet thing or two, and then we settled down upon the floor to tell ghost stories. We spread out a lot of cushions comfortably all around, and in the midst set a large tin pan containing a plate, in which burned a mixture of salt and alcohol. This cast a pale flickering light over all the faces and gave the proper weird and ghostly effect. In spite of this, however, the ghost stories rather languished. Mr. Gruzzletree now, all at once, drew a heavy sigh, keeping Miss Ernestine de Gilbert, it might be noted, well under observation. "Speaking of Christmas presents," said he, when nobody at all had been speaking of Christmas presents, "speaking of Christmas presents, fellow sufferers, I'd like to submit a case to you." "Anything up to a packing case. Now is your time. There are stockings here that will hold it." "Speak for yourself, Mr. Chinkerton," said Mrs. Grumbold. "I thought it more magnanimous to speak for Miss Gobboy or Miss Tenstroke." Both those young ladies uttered shrill exclamations of protest and resentment at this audacity. "Now, suppose a man had bought a present for another man, and then yielded to the temptation of keeping it himself?" went on Gruzzletree. "Mr. Gruzzletree has yielded to a temptation? I'm not surprised at it at all. I think him quite capable of it," said Elsie Tenstroke. "Tell us all about it," clamoured the company. "Well, it's like this. You see before you one but let it pass. Despise me if you will, but hear me. I know not why I speak to you of this now, but probably because there comes to every conscience-burdened criminal a moment when all considerations of prudence must be laid aside." "Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Grumbold, and she vivaciously threw at him a small sofa-pillow that made a convenient missile. "I bought the nicest thing I could think of as a Christmas present for a friend, and then couldn't bear to give it to him. I robbed him, as it were." He bowed his head, as in gloomy remorse, upon his hand. "And I could never look him in the face again." "It was only between you and yourself, wasn't it?" asked Amy Gobboy. "He never knew it, and besides, a person has a right to change his mind." "No, that was the worst of it. There was glaring testimony and proof. Witnesses could be produced to show that I had actually bought it for him." "Well, it could be easily explained, and I suppose nothing came of it?" My dear friend was ruined, and the article I had proposed to give him would have saved him. That's all. I am the cause of all his calamities." "Will you stop your circumlocutions and go on?" demanded Mrs. Grumble peremptorily. "I used to see the article in the show window day after day as I passed by. I thought I could get it at any time, and so was in no hurry. 'It's the very thing for old Fred,' I used to say to myself and the others. 'It will suit him to a T. Old Fred shall have it as sure as my name is Sam Grasseltree.' One day it was missing, and I had a regular panic. But I found it had only been taken out of the window to be shined up a bit. That decided me. I bought it at once. Some poor devil of a mechanic had got it up for himself originally, and it was the only one of the kind. There never was a thing more exactly adapted to Fred's case." At the name of Fred, Mr. Gilbert, who had sat hitherto in dignified silence, had visibly started, and she began to pay close attention. "What was it?" demanded a chorus of voices. "It was a most ingenious invention. I returned to America with it about 3 weeks afterwards." "Do you want to drive us mad? Article, thing, invention, what was it?" "What was it? It was an Antol Aphobotachys. That's what it was." "Is that all of it? Do you get a commission? Shall we leave orders for it at the grocer's, the stationer's, or the blacksmith's? Tell us instantly what you mean, and cease this aggravating conduct." "That's a part of it. It was a musical early rising without alarm clock." "Oh, indeed? Only an alarm clock?" "No, a without alarm clock. Instead of springing at you in a ferocious way, as those clocks usually do, like a kind of moral rattlesnake, it began gently, soothingly, with soft mellifluous notes, and gradually increased the pressure till you were thrilled all over with an idea of the grandeur and glory of getting up to breakfast and going about your day's work. I tell you what, when you had once known the Antol Aphobotachys, it was invaluable. But at first I had hesitated between that and a Thlaupilacusticon." "Is that all of it? And would your friend have liked that too?" "He was an amateur of all curious contrivances, and I'm sure he would." "What was that curious contrivance?" "Oh, that was a combined crush hat and acoustic fan. You could use it at the opera, you know, or a concert, for bringing the sounds nearer, and it might serve to fill up a gap in the conversation now and then." "Or a gap in one's information." "Even this would have saved him from much of the misery into which he fell. I was Fred Bradstock's worst enemy. Imagine the feelings with which I first met him after thus purloining his property." Miss Ernestine de Gilbert started now indeed. One would say she had some peculiar interest in this name. Mrs. Grumble endeavoured in the dark to kick the narrator warningly with her small foot, but did not succeed in reaching him. "If it's Fred Bradstock, you mean," here put in her husband, "you were not troubled with confronting him very much of late. He's been at the Antipodes, or somewhere near it, for I don't know how long. He's in the Bermudas now, I believe, with a yachting party." "Happily for me, yes," assented the narrator, with a new access of mournfulness. "What I tell you of happened a good while ago. We are judged by our intentions, and I felt guilty before him, even from the first, though I little suspected then what genuine cause I was going to have for it." A gasp merging into a disdainful sniff, or a disdainful sniff merging into a gasp, came from the direction of Mr. Gilbert. "The worst burden on me was the witnesses who had known of my intentions. They all returned to this country at once. I had to be a whole corps of detectives in myself to keep them and Fred apart. I paid the fare of one of them to Florida, got another away on some plausible pretext to Montreal, and let the third into such a good thing in an interest of mine in a Montana stock ranch that he couldn't possibly refuse to go there. Why not confess, if you felt so badly about it as you say?" "You do not know the Antol Aphobo, the persuader, when you talk like that. Will you believe that I, inheriting a nervous temperament and almost constitutionally incapable of sleeping after 7 in the morning, actually cultivated the habit of taking opiates to enjoy as much as possible the delightful sensation of being waked up by the antol aphobo tachystaphleron? Are all your long names strictly necessary? Demanded Miss Amy Gawboy suspiciously. Are they really the names of the things? They strike me as very good names for the things, and I give them for what they are worth. You see, the case of Fred was peculiar. On the one hand, he had some heart trouble and couldn't be called by any of the existing alarm clocks because the rattling metallic things might have scared him into an untimely grave. On the other hand, he needed some assistance, for he could not be depended upon to wake up on his own account. Out of these conditions developed the possibility for evil in my duplicity, in all its glaring horror. Charlie Chinkerton, a versatile genius, had placed himself at the piano and was playing a slow accompaniment to the narrative. At the last words, he struck 2 or 3 chords of heavily ominous import. I began to trace constantly in Fred's record the baneful influence of my theft. There was the case, for instance, where he lost the grizzly in California. His guide inadvertently failed to call him, and the hand was up and away 3 hours before he put in an appearance. It was a stuffed grizzly, it is true, but if he had been there he would have known it and saved the reputation of the party, for he had been taken in once with a stuffed deer in the Adirondacks. "Grosseltree, you are up to something in all this," said our hostess. "I don't know what it is, but I think I ought to throw another sofa cushion at you." And she proceeded to do so. "You are too good," said the storyteller, easily catching this ineffective missile. Then he continued. The antol, the musical early rising without alarm persuader, would have saved him from being left by the steam launch at the ocean yacht race. It would have saved him from being left at the Great Rockaway steeplechases, and again, it would have saved him from being late at his broker's office the day that KG and Q stock jumped up 20 points in an hour. I need not go over the list of all the other appointments, whether of business or pleasure, he disastrously missed, through the same cause. But the really tragic episode was the breaking off of his engagement. Chinkerton here struck a most discordant crash upon the keys. "This is really too much," exclaimed the hostess, whether she meant Chinkerton at the piano or some other circumstance. Miss de Gilbert, who had shown signs of extreme restlessness for some time past, attempted to rise from the improvised divan. It was not so easy a matter, however, in the toilet of the day, and before she had progressed far, Grasseltree, continuing imperturbably, but more rapidly, had said, "They say the girl he was engaged to was a perfect fascinator, just too pretty for anything. She was from somewhere out of town, Spruton, Duville, Yonkers, Baltimore, or something that way. She was rich." A scoff of indignation from Miss de Gilbert, engaged in her efforts to get up. Beautiful, refined, accomplished, most charming in every way. She was, as I have been told, all that the most ardent fancy could paint, and you conceive the bitterness of this avowal, was the sole cause of this breaking of that engagement. Miss de Gilbert settled back with a sigh upon her cushions. Mrs. Grumbold telegraphed her reassuringly with eyes and lips. "He does not know. I have not told anybody." It was apparent that Grasseltree could not be stopped. One thing was certain, that he held the attention of the company, particularly that of its most perverse member, very fixedly. The union of those two admirable persons, exactly suited to each other, was prevented by the Antolafo, the musical early rising producer. Once more, poor Fred was missing at the critical moment. The wedding? No, but almost the next thing to it. His fiancée's heart had been set on having him appear at a certain dinner, to meet her relatives and so on. He did not appear, and she threw him over, and that was the end of it all. but it was only the fault of not having the missing machine, and not his own in the list. I'll tell you all about it. One of the peculiarities of his affianced, a part of her charm, showing force and real character, was that she was implacable, unchanging as the laws of the Medes and Persians. It is a delicate matter to touch upon, and I don't pretend to fathom the subtle mysteries of the female heart, but I have somehow gathered that there was another girl at the dinner who flattered herself she might have been a successful rival for Fred's affections, and it was thought he did not want to see her so publicly. Of course, it is amply demonstrated that there was nothing in this, if only by the fact that Fred has never set eyes upon that one since. But will you tell us what a musical alarm clock can have had to do with his being late at dinner? You don't want us to believe he slept all day, I suppose? It was in Philadelphia, now I think of it, it was in Philadelphia. They dined there in the middle of the day. For all I know, it was 12 o'clock sharp. But even if it was, considering the occasion, and that he was visiting there expressly on her account, he might have managed to get up by noon at least, once in his life. Oh, he did, he did. I happen to know that he did a lot of things that day, bright and early. He went out to Bryn Mawr and attended the city troop races. He was on the jump from morning till night. But then, self-contradictory person, cried Mrs. Grumble, what are you telling us? Why could he not have gone to the dinner as well as elsewhere? He mistook the day, you know. That's the point. He thought it was another day. But in the name of long-suffering patience, what had your wretched alarm clock to do with his mistaking the day? Oh, don't speak of it in that way, he protested tenderly. Well, your absurd alarm clock, then? Pardon me, not an alarm clock. It was a without alarm clock. It was a musical early rising. But what had that to do with his mistaking the day? Oh, yes, it had a calendar attachment. Didn't I tell you about that? Or did I only mention its self-lighting candle? If he had seen the calendar, you know, if he had seen that index hand come round slowly, but inexorably, pointing out your Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, no such dreadful error could have ever arisen. With this, the company began to break up. While the preparations for departure were going on, Mr. Grasseltree and Miss Ernestine de Gilbert gravitated together, casually as it were, and drew a little apart. "How did you know who I was?" asked the lady, with a languid, proud way of poising her head. "From the description. Yours were the eyes, the hair, a certain stately carriage I had heard of from Fred too often to be forgotten. There was a particular charming dimple near the left corner of the mouth. That will do on that score. When I discovered you here, I induced Mrs. Grumble, by special request, to let me take you in." "Did you, indeed? I half suspected it. Well, I knew you too. You were one of his dissolute companions." "Ha ha ha!" laughed her auditor, with only a rather hollow sort of mirth, however. "Tell me," she continued, "was there a single word of truth in all your ridiculous story?" "I really mean that there is, that there was, about such a clock. And I really mean that Fred adores the very ground you walk on. He is one of the most wretched men in 2 hemispheres without you. There, that will do also. Were you serious when you said that his health was not good, that he was disposed to heart disease?" "Aha!" reflected Grasseltree. "So the wind lies in that quarter. She takes a little interest, after all. I honestly think his heart is in no danger," he said aloud, "except in so far as it may be affected by his sufferings on your account." "But you have given him such an absurd, stupid character. He is not the indolent person you represent him to be. He occupies himself in a great many useful ways besides in his sports. Go back and say something that will set those people right about him." "It would hardly be necessary. I fear those people are already in the habit of taking Samuel Grasseltree's utterances with some grains of salt." "Then what does this all mean?"
she asked, infinitely puzzled. That I would give half I possess, as the novelists say,
to bring you and my old young friend, Frederick Bradstock,
together again. If, in the meantime, nothing has happened to prevent it, why can it not be done? May I venture to ask, with infinite respect, whether anything has happened on your side? No, she replied diffidently, nothing. Then, as between two sensible and well-disposed human beings, frankly, why can it not be done? No, no, it cannot be done. I will not hear of it on any account. The fact is, he did not want to go to that dinner from the first, and I had to try and make him. I knew I must put my foot down in the beginning. Now tell me the real reason why he stayed away. I am sure you do not really think old Fred would get up false ones to account for it? Expostulated his friend Grasseltree. He has never given any, except that he forgot the day. Why not accept that one, then, by way of little variety? It's gospel truth, I assure you. Fred was in a strange town. He had a lot of things to do, and he's always something of a dreamer, you know. Bless you, what's the harm in a little absent-mindedness? The greatest men have been troubled that way. Look at me. I left my best umbrella in the omnibus this very morning. All Fred Bradstock needs, my dear Miss de Gilbert, is an accomplished wife. With just the right kind of wife to infuse her own method and precision into, shall we say, his madness, he'd be a model of models in every particular. I dare say, rejoined his hearer dryly. Let us hope he may get such a one. I have seen him knock his head against the wall on account of his conduct 12 times. It was so uncomplimentary to her, he says, it can't be explained. She treated me just as I deserved. She couldn't have done otherwise. Of course I could not, assented Ernestine de Gilbert. But, flushing very much and almost tearful, why didn't he do something further? He might have persisted. He might have kept on trying to explain. As I understand it, you would not see him, and poor Fred was never glib with his pen. If I am right also, you returned some of his letters unopened. Am I right? She lowered her head a trifle, as if in haughty admission that this was so. But somehow the shadow of a brooding sorrow did not seem to hang over Miss de Gilbert half as much now as formerly. Fred got it into his head at last that you were glad the match was off, and that you liked someone else better. On this wrong tack, as we now see it was, he tried to brace up by devoting himself to other women, but it was all no go. I happened to see it for myself, and I tell you, there is not an unhappier man in Christendom today than that same Fred Bradstock. You must go at once and say something before all those people to set him right, exclaimed his hearer, a little irrelevantly. Ladies and gentlemen, thereupon began Grasseltree, advancing in a sort of professional way. Ladies and gentlemen of the company, I wish to say that, while driven by a reckless despair to ease an overburdened conscience, I may at the same time have seemed to depreciate another person. Let me say that Fred Bradstock is no inmate of the Castle of Indolence, and that, while all the claims of the untold Aphobotakistaphoron remain as represented, anybody has got to get up very early in the morning, indeed, to catch him napping. I seem to feel, too, a certain prophetic sense that the end of his troubles may be near. I would withdraw no essential statement, but I suggest that all that part of the allegations relating to Frederick Bradstock be stricken out, or construed only in that Pickwickian sense so proper to this genial East 34th Street observance at this hospitable Christmas home. That is, this home-like Christmas occasion at this observant. In short, I am thoroughly convinced that so far from needing adventitious aids, the more persons you sent to waken Frederick Bradstock, the sounder he would sleep, whereas the fewer and the less— "Don't make it worse," hastily whispered a voice at his sleeve, and the next moment she began hesitatingly, "Of course, if you say Fred is really sorry—" In the very next mail there went to the Bermudas a letter in which Frederick Bradstock was assured that the chances of winning back his old sweetheart were now most promising. I told them all after dinner, the letter concluded, a wild tale of a without alarm clock I had meant to give you. By hook and by crook, I fixed it all up with her, and it's rather a handsome piece of work on my part. By the way, that clock isn't a bad one. I'll send you the maker's name. I dare say they are in the market by this time. Mr. Gilbert's yours, my boy. Come home and take her and the blessing of Samuel Grasseltree. At the very earliest moment, too, returned an answer from the Bermudas. I'm coming home. Of course he is, lucky young dog. Why shouldn't he? Of course he is, interpolated Grasseltree complacently. I'm. Bless me, what's this? What's this? I'm on my wedding trip, married to a lovely girl I met in the islands. Affair been on some time, but you've been so deuced off these last few years, no chance to tell you about it. Comparisons are odorous, but the de Gilbert, well, the fact is, the de Gilbert was a little inclined to be domineering. Excuse short letter. Tell you all about it when we meet. Samuel Grasseltree was not an accomplished whistler, but on this occasion he whistled. For an instant he raised his hand against the without alarm clock as if to do it violent injury, but instead of yielding to this impulse, he took it down from the modest place it had occupied in his bedroom and placed it boldly on the most conspicuous wall of his apartment. After that, he sat down and reflected on the diverse characters of the persons who had heard his story on Christmas Eve, and particularly on certain positive traits in Miss de Gilbert. He began to think he would take another European trip.
End of A Christmas Crime by William Henry Bishop.